very exciting to be here, and I think we're all very excited to be on this panel to talk about document content and steps we've taken to improve it. So I think the theme you're going to hear throughout is collaboration. Collaboration at the health system level, the vendor level, and the network level. And we're going to work through each member of the panel talking through from their different seats, and then we'll have a time at the end for questions. But before we get going, I agreed to do introductions. And so up first, actually, Dr. Lane is going to talk. He's hopefully, I expect most of you know him, but is a practicing primary care physician, board-certified clinical informaticist who's been a leader in advocating and supporting the use of Care Everywhere in California and around the country. He's the physician director for health information policy, security, and interoperability at Sutter Health. And within this role, he's helped develop a robust program of information exchange, including direct secure messaging, e-health exchange, and enterprise, or expanding the enterprise HIE. From Dr. Lane, we'll move to Matt Doyle, who's a software developer at with Epic on their Care Everywhere team. And for folks who aren't familiar, Care Everywhere is their interoperability platform that's grown significantly over the last several years, covering 6 different countries, 3.5 million documents a month. And then Mike Warner, our senior strategist from Cerner, passionate about interoperability, working with physicians' practices to connect hospitals and reference labs to get data electronically, and currently working to improve clinical users' experience with interoperability, and also co-chairs the use case committee at the Commonwealth Health Alliance. So up first, actually hand it to Dr. Lane to talk a little about some of the initiatives that got the momentum that got some of this rolling.
Yeah, so thanks, Brett, and thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate your participation. So I was asked to talk a little bit about a very local experience that we've had in California. I work at Sutter Health, which is a large integrated system, mostly in Northern California. And we are in an ecosystem in our area with a lot of different health systems and patients that are very mobile and move around a lot. And a lot of our patients at Sutter Health go to another organization called Dignity Health, which has very much a similar footprint. We use Epic at Sutter Health. They use Cerner at Dignity Health. And as I think most of you know, cross-vendor information exchange has its own excitement to it. And as we take care of patients, as I take care of patients in my own practice, I and my colleagues were struggling with the challenges of the sort of interoperability that we were seeing between our two systems. And I called up my colleague, Dr. Dave Comita, who's an informaticist at Dignity, and we were working through some of these things, and we said, hey, let's get our vendors together and we'll work collaboratively and see if we can sort some of this out. But we were doing a lot of information exchange. We have a lot of shared patients, and we had already established exchange through the eHealth exchange. So Dignity and Sutter both signed up for eHealth exchange, and that was the main pipe that we were using long before the current new exchange that's happening via Commonwealth and Carequality. So we got our vendors together and we said, now that we've got the pipes laid and we're moving the data, we want to start looking more at the value of that data and how we can really bring it into the work stream, bring it into the workflows of the providers and make the most use of it. So we got together, the vendors showed up, we started a series of monthly meetings over the last couple of years. We've met almost 20 times on roughly a monthly basis, and we dug into the documents. We got a lot of collaboration from both vendors looking at what document types they were using, what sections were in the documents, what data was in the sections. We looked at patient matching, and we got the vendors to actually share with each other, what's your matching algorithm? How are you doing this? Why do we sometimes see a match go in one direction but not the other direction? And really got a lot of traction there. We looked at some cases where I would be able to get a direct message that came all the way to me. It matched going in one direction, but then when I tried to do a query back in the other direction, it failed on the match. So you could really see the impact of those changes. But we worked through this. We did a lot of focus on the document content. We invited Dee Dee Davis. She came and educated us about the CCDA, and we really understood that. Each of the vendors was able to share in the collaborative group the specifics of their document structure, how they generated it, when they generated it. There were issues that we identified with a lot of that. And then we started to make changes. We started to identify opportunities for each of the vendors and each of our systems to make tweaks and changes. And our exchange improved. The volume of exchange improved and the quality of the exchange improved as well. So it was really an excellent collaboration. We also have continued to move forward and look at other opportunities. The work that we did to try to get clinical notes, we started with Chris Dickerson and the Carequality Document Content Workgroup, and then when the Carequality Commonwealth Group came together and the transition to Brett, we continued to bring issues that we were identifying in California to that group, and really, I think, had a lot of contributions to make to the joint document content work that came out of that. And now we are in the process of trying to implement those changes. We'll be talking more about those changes later on. And then I also want to make a shout out. The other thing that we've been looking at is trying to use direct as another means for interoperability between our systems, looking for opportunities to both optimize the directories and the utility of that. So we've made real progress. We've learned a lot from each other, and I think we've been able to take our learnings and share them with the larger community. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Matt, to talk about how Epic was involved in all this.
Yeah, well, and I think that this is a great opportunity. We all know that we're playing in the same sandbox. We all know that we need to be better at sharing information. And a lot of times what that takes is the type of work that this project had, where people dig in, they look at the details, they say, what happened here wasn't what I was expecting to happen. Can we put these things side by side? And can we really figure out how do we make this better? That collaboration needs to include not just vendors, but also providers. We need folks who are living this day in and day out, who have very practical feedback that they can share to give that to vendors so that we can understand, okay, well, in the realm of all the possibilities of what we could be doing, what are the things that are going to be the highest value? What are going to help you to deliver better care for your patients? As Stephen mentioned, along the way, there are a lot of opportunities where we made some changes to the system. What I think is interesting is that a lot of those didn't necessarily require development. Often there were options that were already in the software. I think of software almost like a large machine. There's a lot of knobs, there's a lot of switches. And so it's not necessarily a question of do we need to go and do more development, but sometimes it's just what are the options in our system? What are the options in the other system? And how do we put those side by side? And how do we make those line up best for the staff who are going to be using it? Now, some of those things are optimizations that now that we understand them, we need to look at how do we help everybody else improve. So some of the best practices, some of them I think are pretty straightforward. Things like, and I've heard this a couple times already in this conference, providers need access to notes. And not just the progress note, we need the specialty consult notes, we need the H&Ps, we need the surgical notes. So I think that's an easy example where we say, okay, that's a thing that we all have to do, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. The patient matching, which Stephen mentioned just a moment ago, I think is another great example, a little bit harder than just including notes, but a great opportunity where we can say, let's look at how this is working. Let's take test cases or patients where it didn't turn out the way you thought it was going to, and let's really follow this through. And let's get folks who are experts on both sides of what's happening so that we can really get a holistic picture and figure out how do we improve together. Another ongoing opportunity that I think is out there is how do we address duplicative data? So everyone who has used outside data, everyone who's gotten CCDs and looked at patients, we all have experienced there's duplicate data. I see the same medication 3 or 4 times on this patient. I see 2 versions of the same problem. And so how do we take this data and harmonize that down? And that's something that Epic's been working on for a while, looking at not just the basic data types, but like meds, problems, allergies, but some of the other more advanced data types as well. And I think collaborations like this maybe could be a great opportunity where we keep looking at those things and we look at the data sets from both systems together and find ways that everybody can improve in the future. So looking at the outcome here, I think one of the big opportunities is how do we take the lessons learned and how do we apply it to the community at large? So it's great that Sutter and Dignity have made all this progress, and I think that's wonderful. Now we have to look out across the country and take all those lessons and say, how do we get everybody else live in production with those best practices? Within our community, one of the opportunities that we have are regional users group meetings. So we have 19 regional collaboratives amongst our community. These are usually based either at a state level or maybe around a large metro area, where providers and IT folks from various roles get together and say, what are you doing that's successful? What am I doing that's successful? And how do we share those best practices? So I think that might be a venue where we could take some of these best practices and bring it out to the community. So working together directly with one of Cerner's clients really was an opportunity to look at the content of the documents and how to improve there. And up next, I think Mike has a few thoughts to share.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, CCD, when you talk to a physician, if they know what a CCD is, what's the general reaction? Usually it's, God. Yeah, I stopped looking at those after I looked at one. There's been a great evolution in CCD. I think the industry kind of leapt forward and tried to get fully discrete and completely left out the narrative. And as we began lighting up Commonwealth connections, we kept hearing this over and over again. I was invited to participate in the Northern California Collaborative, and I heard a lot of the similar feedback from Dr. Lane, from Dr. Comita, and it's like, wait, we've been talking about this within our own Commonwealth work groups. Some of the problems with CCDs, we've had work groups spun up that really couldn't produce any tangible improvements. Started talking about notes and narratives within the Northern California Collaborative. Then got invited to start discussing CCDA documents and within Carequality. Well, all of a sudden we've got 3 different groups talking about the exact same problem. How can we get some of this narrative note type data? So that's when we had a conversation within a Commonwealth meeting, and we determined, hey, we should collaborate across these whole lines to solve, at this point, maybe just even if we could solve the narrative problem and come up with a good way to communicate narrative that's within the specifications that have already been outlined, that's going to be a huge accomplishment, and that's going to really give providers more of the data that they've really been trying to look for. So participating in the work group, we've developed a set of recommendations that both Commonwealth and Carequality are taking a look at based on the provider feedback and zeroing in on this one problem. And it all started not in one place or another, it just kind of bubbled up. And I think that's what Carequality, Commonwealth, and these types of organizations can collaborate together, bring us vendors together to talk about the issues that the providers are seeing and get their input. Not every problem or issue is going to be solvable per se that we hear in the CCDA. We've got the fire specification that we're going to continually be able to fine tune and tweak. But with these new metaphors, with these new networks and frameworks, we have the opportunity to hear from our providers and then discuss the problems and then bring the vendors together to actually get tangible changes and improvements. And to Matt's point, that's great, you figured it out, vendors, but then we also have to continually push that back down into our clients as configuration changes or the newer, better code. And we're always looking at ways to do that. Cerner, we have a way to, a model experience, if you will, for our clients to adopt these changes, and we're continually adjusting those as we learn, as we fix things, as we improve our content. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brett.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, all. I didn't even introduce myself, I realized. I'm Brett Marquardt. If you've ever said a dirty word about standards or consolidated CDA, likely I've written some of that text. So I try to do a little mix of standards and implementation with the idea to make usable standards. And I think it's a really hard thing, and it can't be done. It's a really team sport, and improving content exchange, it really takes a village. So the joint Carequality Commonwealth work group kind of launched in January of this year, And I think what's really exciting is when, the first couple calls, it's how do we prioritize what we want to tackle? So, provenance came up, versioning came up, clinical notes was high on the list, encounter summary documents. Very quickly we had a very large list. And for those who've been in these work groups before, it's, how do we pick the high value ones? And we were very fortunate to have several clinicians involved in the group and a very strong mix of vendors. And, all the vendors were hearing clinical notes, that narrative is key. And so that one very much bubbled to the top of the list. The other one that came up, which may not be as obvious, is the idea of encounter summary document exchange. Everyone here is CCD. CCD is one type of document that the vendors and the community has implemented as a way to kind of send a dump of data. So instead of sending, everything that happened with that patient's last encounter, the CCD kind of came of, all right, how do we put everything for the last year, 2 years, whatever we can fit into that document. And that's what people have come to think of as document exchange. And so as part of this work group, we agreed that we really need to reset and think about, what does it mean to actually send an encounter summary document? Another piece of it was when we send these documents, how do we clearly communicate to the receiver, what's actually included in it? Vendors have different defaults. When you query for these documents, they include different amounts of content, and it's not always clear what you're getting. And so we had a nice conversation on that. So on the encounter summary exchange, I think for folks who've read all of Consolidated CDA, there's actually 13 different document types in there. So you can actually exchange a very specific procedure note, an operative note, history and physical, discharge summary. There's this whole suite of documents. And I think when the folks who first crafted that standard were thinking is that the vendors would all implement all 13 document types, and this is exactly the clinicians would write to these very beautiful, these clean sections, and that's what we would use in exchange. And it didn't quite go that way. And so one of the kind of things we wrestled with a little bit in this content work group is, well, do we encourage the vendors to implement this full suite of documents, or do we step back a bit and what's a realistic first step? And it didn't take long to settle in of, hey, in encounter summary, you have a hospital visit, everyone agrees or shouldn't say everyone, it was fairly clear, the consensus, you can't say everyone, but a large group was that at the end of a hospital visit, it's common to give a patient a discharge summary. We may not all agree on the exact contents of the discharge summary, but at the minimum, like the patient and future clinicians want this discharge summary note, discharge medication, discharge diagnosis. So let's make it simple. Hospital, check the box, what's required, discharge summary document. And then we send to the outpatient ambulatory side. There's a whole mix of care that can be done in the outpatient setting. And we looked at all the different kind of standard documents that were available and said, the progress note is this kind of fairly generic template document. We can mix a little bit of extra sections here and there. Let's just start with that and say, all right, for outpatient summaries, we're going to focus on the progress note. And within both these documents, we're going to require the clinician narrative to be present, the clinical note. And with the clinical note, what we found is HL7 had done some standards work, but it hadn't been necessarily communicated to the broader community. The examples that went with how you share a clinical note weren't quite there. And so as part of the content work group, kind of through the spring of this year, we added some additional examples, some additional guidance of, hey, if you have a procedure note and you actually know what procedure it is, it's really great. Link those two together, and here's how you do that. But I think what was so fun for me within this work group is actually having clinical input throughout. And I think, thinking about actually kind of bridging to, hey, we actually have end users who are trying to use this data and giving us feedback of, all right, this is what's going to make my life a little bit better, and being able to develop specifications and guidance that go along with that. And one of those folks was Dr. Lane, and I'll hand it to him next to talk about his experience.
Yeah, so I think that was so important to highlight the critical nature of the narrative and the clinical notes as part of the exchange. As you say, that really has been missing. And these big CCDs that are really clinical summary documents for a patient do bring value, but they don't bring the kind of value that we want when we're in the exam room, when we're in the hospital taking care of the patient. What we really want is to see a longitudinal record of the patient's historical care, and we want to be able to say, oh, you were seen in this hospital, and what was that about? Or you were seen by this cardiologist, and what did she say? So the idea of being able to construct that longitudinal record is really based on the premise that you can get these encounter-specific documents that have the specific narrative notes in them. And that's what the document content work group recommended, that has now been bubbled up through both Commonwealth and Carequality leadership and really accepted. So at this point, as of today, that the recommendations from that work group have now been distributed to the developers at Epic, to the members of Commonwealth, through Carequality. It'll go out to all the other vendors that have been implementing within the Carequality framework with the expectation, not a requirement yet, but at least the expectation that they will work on developing that with the goal, from my perspective as a clinician, that whether my patient gets seen at a next-gen clinic, at an eClinicalWorks office, at a hospital using Cerner, that in all those cases I will be able to get those encounter-specific documents and bring them together. So I also wanted to say a little bit about our Northern California Collaborative. Even though it started just with Sutter Health and Dignity Health, we've recently opened it up, and we've invited some other Cerner customers, some other Epic customers to participate, and we've made it bigger and I think better by the additional voices. But it's important to realize that it's just a pair. It's just two vendors trying to figure out how they're exchanging. Because independent of this, we're having other conversations with clinics that are using NextGen and eClinicalWorks and Athena Health, and I just don't have the time. We can't sponsor all of these pairwise collaboratives. This is why we have Carequality. This is why we all come together as an industry to figure out how to move this ball forward. The other thing, interestingly, that I wanted to share about our California Collaborative is because we did bring together in this regional user group not only the large Epic customers but the large Cerner customers, we also were able to come together and speak with one voice to our state. You heard Dr. Eisenberg speak earlier today. Our state came up with their own way of managing the PDMP queries. And they came up with this requirement for us to report Parkinson's disease to a new state registry. And in both cases, the state, as we heard in the last meeting, they've got their IT resources and they're doing the best they can with what they have, but they're not always fully informed about really what are the capabilities of the systems that they're asking to report to them. So we were able to come together as a community to interact with our state and really get tremendous traction with them in terms of having them evolve their systems to be able to better interact with all of our EHRs. So that's been really exciting. Brett asked me to talk a little bit about what's next. So again, I'm looking forward to this longitudinal view of my patient's care, regardless of what vendor system they were seeing. And then Brett's heard me say this many times, the next thing I want is results. I think sharing results between organizations in a seamless, frictionless way is critical. There's some progress being made doing that in same vendor exchange, but elevating that to be cross-vendor, vendor agnostic, if you will, is going to be really critical. And again, whether those results are going in documents, via FHIR, what have you. Today, we all know you can build and maintain an HL7v2 interface to send results, but that's very expensive point to point, and we need to move on to that. There's all sorts of other specific data types that we want to be able to share. Those I think are well laid out in the draft U.S. core data for interoperability that the ONC put out earlier this year. And what I'm hoping is that we're going to get the band back together, that we're going to keep working through this document content work group, or really just content work group, because it shouldn't just be about documents, and continue to improve the quality and the utility of the data that we're exchanging.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to open up for questions here in a minute, but you hear the story of the Dignity Sutter collaboration and the vendors, Cerner and Epic working together, and then the idea of growing it to actually initiative of Commonwealth and Carequality. It was really great to have Jiten and Dave sponsor this work group and get us we're all kind of working with getting us all together to develop some of these content recommendations. A question that came to my mind as we were developing this panel, well, there's actually lots, but I trimmed it down, was to Matt was, Epic, I know both Epic and Cerner and other vendors have done reconciliation for a long time, and Epic on, problems, medications, and allergies. What's next? Like, what are the next kind of key data elements you think you'll start to kind of absorb into your system?
Yeah, as you said, I think most vendors do at least that minimum because regulation made that a requirement. But we need to do this because it's helping providers deliver better care, not just because it's regulation. And to do that, we need to talk to providers, we need to listen to feedback, and we need to get guidance from our users about where do we go next. So in addition to the meds, allergies, and problems that you outlined, we've had reconciliation for immunizations for some time. And then recently, we've also expanded to labs, which is what Stephen was just talking about. Now, I think labs are a little bit different because no one wants to one by one say accept, reject, because patients have potentially thousands of them. So I think when you get something like that, you have to take a very different approach to it. You have to say how much of this can be automated. Are there data points discretely within the information that can help you figure out and extract the data and interweave it with your local record such that you're not making an MA or some other support person go through them all one at a time. So I think that that's an open challenge as we move to some of the data types that are a little bit higher volume. The other thing that we've been doing a lot with data reconciliation, and I mentioned it earlier, is trying to harmonize some of the duplicative information. So I think meds are a great example where a patient's script has changed 3 times over the last calendar year, and you get 3 versions of that medication, and you look at that and you figure, well, what do I have to do with this now? And you have to figure out, well, what's the most recent version, and then confirm with the patient, is that what they're taking? Are there ways that the computer could look at that variable set of data for the same medication and tell you, well, here's the most recent version of it, that's probably the one that you want, tee that up for the clinician to add to the medical record, but still keep provenance and still keep a way to discover all the variation that was harmonized down just in case you need to look at it. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there.
Yeah, it's complex. Well, thanks. It's funny. I thought of a question for Mike too about, you know, this work group was about documents, but I think Dr. Lane made a great point. It was like, you know, we're not thinking just about documents. The clinicians are, you know, thinking beyond that. And so as we move to other standards, FHIR or what's next, you know, Mike, what other problems, what problems do you think are going to carry forward into those standards, or what things, you know, may be solved by them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty universally agreed that a lot of inherent, you know, fundamental issues with CCDA documents or some of the things that we learned have been accounted for with the FHIR spec. So at some level, all of us vendors want to move to the FHIR spec. We know that it's going to open up Exchange not just for your traditional brick and mortar physician office and hospital, but then allow for other venues of care to open up because they don't need everything in the document. Is Quester LabCorp going to assemble a CCA document? No, but I bet they'd love to plug into FHIR resources to either pull specific data or open up their databases so that you could query on a greater subset of results. So I think, you know, as we move and talk about content, I think we have to be cognizant of where do we think that the fix is, where do we feel the improvement is, and is it time to move to FHIR for that specific data element or data point and really gravitate towards that. So it's not going to be easy. CCDA documents are very well adopted in their current state, and we'll continue to improve that, but I think there's going to be some very purposeful movement to say, hey, for this data element, let's move to FHIR. Let's get to where we need to be and rip the Band-Aid off. So I see great promise with FHIR. It's going to continue to take time there, but Carequality is now starting to talk about it. Commonwealth is now starting to talk about it, and we just need to zero in on some really good use cases to just make that leap into the pool and start accepting them.
Yeah. Well, thanks. It's an exciting new standard. I think the hype is probably still a little bigger than what the standard will supply, but it's definitely has some, like there's no clinical notes resource, there's no clinical notes guidance, and some of them are working on, like collectively, some of the vendors are working on right now to add clinical notes guidance to the specification, but the idea of, there are some, you know, carrying the document lessons into the FHIR specification, and you know, still work to be, it's not just a standards thing. So Dr. Lane, I think, you know, to kind of wrap up my questions, I guess, is what do you know, you've been involved in, I think, all of these work groups in some capacity. Like, what to you is like the most important lesson you've learned being a part of these groups?
I think really, and I said it as we were coming up here, collaboration. I think it's so critical that we get all the stakeholders. We're talking about providers, we talked about vendors, but there are other stakeholders involved in the Carequality community that really need to come to the table and inform this work if we're going to be able to move this data efficiently and in a way that really has a lot of utility. And as a clinician, I think also just the need to identify problems that you're seeing on the ground elevate those, bring them to people's attention, then work on them in an iterative way. I don't think we're going to have revolutionary change. I mean, maybe fire is going to be revolutionary, but I like your idea, Mike, that maybe there are pieces that we can start, maybe these results that we're talking about, we should focus on fire instead of keeping them, in the document. But I think making iterative changes to meet the needs that are identified by the patients, the providers, the other members of the care team.
Yeah. Awesome, thank you. So well, we're not done yet. What questions do folks have for our panelists? Yeah, we got a few hands up. We got any do we have microphones?
Do we have mic runners?
Oh,
Huh?
I saw 2 hands go up.
Chris.
No, yeah.
David.
Dave Cates with Manifest Medics. So this is tangentially related to content, but can you collectively, or Stephen, whoever, speak not only to content but workflow? So from the standpoint of the documents that increasingly are robust and provide value in terms of exchange, is it sufficient to query? So when you see a patient in the clinic, you're calling out to other systems where care may have been delivered, or how do you address in a world that's increasingly moving towards population health, value-based care, getting some means by which you're receiving information as care is delivered rather than you calling out to go and gather information at the point of care?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. So in our organization, we've done a lot of work with advanced record location. So we will routinely query for linkages to patient records, query for patients, and then query for documents whenever patients are seen in our organization. And that's really pushed our volume of exchange really significantly. We also obviously receive transitions of care messages as is required, and we get those when patients are seen at other organizations where they know that we have a likelihood of wanting to get that data. And then there's the ad hoc push using direct where that's starting to happen. We've also implemented a pop health automated query, so where we've identified a subset of patients that are in a value-based care arrangement, and on a monthly basis we do a broadcast query to try to see if there's any new data for those patients, and we do that of Dignity Health, for example. So that's a cross-vendor functionality that we do to try to bring that in. So I think that the idea of some sort of event notification, knowing that things have happened, getting that data in, and ingesting that as much as possible. And then you talked about workflow, and I think part of what you may have been getting at is you don't want to have to know to ask. Right? When the patient is there, or when you're doing your analytics on your population, you want that data to already be there, and you want it to be right in line. So, can we bring in the claims data and make that available so that it's informing both clinical care and pop health management? And we're working on all of those fronts right now. There's no turnkey answer to any of them, but we're making real progress. And in fact, just within the last couple of weeks, we've started to be in a position where we're actually utilizing external data that we've brought in by these various means in things like our predictive analytics, in our care gap identification and management. So all of that is now just starting to be informed by external data that we're getting through standards-based exchange.
And I would underscore, I agree with everything Stephen said. I would underscore the automation that you mentioned in there. One of the tools that we have is a geolocation algorithm to automatically locate where patients have a record. And we've had that for several years, but as folks turn that on, we found that they often increase the volume of exchange considerably. Sometimes, the average was between 7 to 15 times increase in exchange. So I think the question in my mind is, automation sounds successful. How can we as software developers like myself build the tools that make the data available so that when providers log into the system, it's not an extra thought process of how do I go find the data. Rather, it's there, and now it becomes a usability exercise to say it's already there. How do we make it easy for you to understand and to take advantage of that information?
Yep, it really comes down to being smart about how you trigger the queries or how you receive information that you get pushed. There's a lot of talk in the industry. More people are grabbing gravitating towards the notion of ADT alerts, right? And in the simplest of form, an ADT alert can show up in your inbox via direct message to indicate, hey, something happened to your patient. But in more advanced forms of that, you can consume that ADT notification, use that as a trigger point to go find other data. Something had happened, let's go find the data and pull it back down, because we want to get away from that button, right? Let's quit making the providers hit the button to go find the data. Be smart about how you go acquire it, and be smart about how you put it into their workflow, so it's much easier to deal with. One thing, as a byproduct of this, everyone's going to be wired up very shortly, and connectivity is not going to be the issue. It's going to be the data overload, and then how do you go find the data in a more intelligent fashion so that you're just not inundated with duplicate data that's just been passed around. So we will continue to get smarter as the technologies are available to us.
Yep.
Question about the narrative section in the CCDA. It talks about a text element, which is generally what we call the narrative, but I assume you're talking about a coded element for the narrative. Is that correct?
So it's a great question. So I'll try not to. CDA is made up of sections. Okay, so you have allergies, problems, medications, and every section of CDA, kind of the magic of when the standard was, it has kind of this narrative block and coded entry pair. And that pair was invented so when a system received it, an advanced system, which many are today, could machine process allergies, machine process medications. But if they couldn't, they could just display that narrative text that was in that section. Okay? And so a lot of the folks in standards development was like, how do we grow these number of sections? But the thing that we missed was there's a note that's written in the EHR. It's a chunk of text. And to give you an idea of where the CDA editors were, is we had kind of this notion of clinicians are going to document through these sections of this, subjective, objective, assessment, plan, and have this nice flow. And in some cases, clinicians may do that, but it's not necessarily coded that way, or it's not blocked, it's not chunked the way we as software developers, and I shouldn't say we had clinician input. It's not necessarily, these notes aren't that neat and tidy, and we need to allow flexibility. And so the idea is we've introduced a new section in CDA that basically is just called the note. And you can tag what type of note it is. It's machine processable in the sense you should discover what type of note it is, but the rest is it's a chunk of text.
I think what's exciting to come is CMS recognizing physician burden, because CMS is a driver and is a hammer that can help physician burden. Part of that burden is the narrative that we move around the note. There's a lot of regurgitation of the data that we see in the codified sections, right? But if CMS can change the way that they think about a note and the way that you justify a payment, adjust it to how our EHRs now capture the data and display the data, we obviously don't have to move around and duplicate data in the form of, hey, it's here in the narrative, hey, it's here codified. We can adjust our systems to basically capture the narrative where it can only really be narrative. That impression and plan, it's really hard to get away from well-formed sentences of thought versus problems, allergies, and meds. I should never have to regurgitate that again, because you can go get that data in a codified way. So I'm hopeful that the whole industry, not just us EHR vendors, but will allow for us to structure the data when it needs to be narrative and then pass the codified, and then help the physician burden by reducing that duplication of the document. Just go through your workflow, document how you think, and let it flow into the system and flow out as intended without all the duplicates.
Hi, Scott from Direct Trust. Really excited to hear about how this has progressed. You guys have made a ton of headway since I was there when there were still arguments going on. I'm sure you don't argue anymore. But I think what I wanted to ask is, so you mentioned that, I can't remember the exact words of the question. It sounded hopeful, but it was shy of a commitment. So the question is, how does it that an organization like Common Law and Carequality together, how do organizations like that get the EHR companies, which are their members, to commit to a minimum level? The only organization that manages to do that is the government. And so far, there isn't an indication that the things that this group is focused on are on their minds very much. I mean, so the detailed work that you all did around figuring out what to do with the episodic documents and treating the summary of care as sort of a table of contents to those additional episodic documents that potentially you might produce 7 or 8 documents per encounter. None of that is in anything that I see coming from government, because that's way more granular than they would generally provide. How do we understand that this actually will happen?
Can I take a short stab at it?
You can take it first.
So again, the document that came out of the work group that Brett led is published. It's on the website, it's available. These vendors at least, Commonwealth has shared it back with its constituent vendors, and I think work is now beginning to try to implement those recommendations. But you're right, they're not requirements. Carequality is launching a new work group that's going to redo the implementation guide for query-based document exchange, and those recommendations are going to be embedded in the new IG. So I think when that comes out, then once it's approved, it will be shared out and it will become a requirement for Carequality exchange. So I think at that level, there's going to be a requirement. Where that fits into government regulations, I think, is an open question. Whether it even needs to fit into government regulations. If Carequality, what Carequality provides, a trusted exchange framework, if that continues to grow into the TEF, then I think that will be a natural evolution, and we'll see regulations, payment schemes, et cetera, built on top of that. But I don't know of any other specific places where we're expecting to see this show up.
Yeah, and I would actually kind of reverse that question from a government regulatory perspective, because if we say, hey, this progress note, it's a great idea, we're going to move the narrative, upon transition of care, we have very explicit regulatory that says thou shalt move a transition of care document, and it's got to have all of these data elements, hence, we're required to send everything. Well, so do we send the progress note along with this transition of care document? What makes more sense to move? So there's current regulations. Maybe they need to be fine-tuned or adjusted for more specific use cases, but what's more valuable to move, or how can we pair that up? Because what we don't want to do is make recommendations, have it go completely against regulatory. So I think there needs to be further conversation on how to do that. But from how do you get vendors to go and do it? I will say, Jenton applies very good soft pressure. You get calls like daily, like, so when are you doing this? So when are you doing this? So when are you doing this? Yes, we have a roadmap that's coming. It does take us a little bit of time. So I would suspect that Dave's probably the same way on the Carequality side. And as the requirements get handed down and timelines associated with that. But I mean, for the most part, yes, all of us vendors have our roadmaps. We want to go do it. This is a great forum to get agreements on that and start that work. I don't think we always have to be required, as long as we can continually make progress.
To add on to that, I agree with everything you said. I'm a pretty simple person. At the end of the day, I listen to what our community members ask us to do, and we look for themes, we look for the patterns. Coming out of conferences like this, I think if a lot of healthcare organizations are saying, look, there's best practices published, we think this is going to help us deliver better care, it's going to help our providers be happier, and there are success stories that demonstrate that this is a really good thing. As vendors hear that, that triggers us to realize, oh yeah, we really need to be listening to the community, and we need to be implementing those best practices. I don't think it requires, in all cases, more government regulation. We were doing interoperability before meaningful use existed. And of course, we meet government regulation, but the reality is if organizations go to their vendors and say, here's what we need, and there's consistency there, vendors respond to that.
Any other questions lingering out there? I mean, I can't help but add, the regulation, we had the first big regulation, well, we've had lots of regulations, but the first big one to start pushing document exchange, I think there are some unintended consequences of how those were written, and both in ONC's understanding of how they were intended and then how the vendors interpreted it. I mean, several vendors, CCD became so popular because vendors figured out they could use that to solve all of the regulatory requirements by putting everything into it. And from my perspective, where it's funny, I think ONC's not here, but I mean, I think ONC's learned a lot in terms of how they regulate, in terms of trying to do gentle pushes of saying, not being completely prescriptive, but try to give guidelines on how to do things. And I think the idea of Carequality and Commonwealth and eHealth Exchange starting to be the place where we as a community come together and say, okay, we've agreed on this requirement, it's going to phase in at this time, is a real positive maturing of the community. And maybe once in a while we need a regulation to make us, move a little faster in areas, but I'm really excited about the idea of the networks and the initiatives kind of starting to drive things.